There's differences between finishing bodies and necks. So largely that's with consideration to making the neck playable. So we don't want to use anything too thick, basically, particularly on the back of the neck where our hand rests against it as we play. We don't want too much friction from our hands against the finish. So regardless of what product you use, what I'd recommend is a matte finish on the back of the guitar. Even if you spray a clear gloss, which we're going to do in this instance, I'll then finish that with a fine grade steel wool just to really buff that down to a matte finish. And that means hands won't get caught up or slowed down while we're playing the guitar. We're going to have to definitely mask off our truss rod. We don't want gunk building up in there, and we're going to mask off our tuning holes as well. But for now, we'll give the guitar a sand. So I'd start with a 180 grit, just a 180 grit, and work our way up from there. Just use your sanding block on the actual headstock itself. It's nice and flat, so we can generally achieve a really nice flat finish there. What I like to do, there are probably more efficient methods of doing this, but just use some tape bunched into a ball, like so. Have the sticky side out, and that way it'll catch. That's why it'll catch anything coming in contact with that area of the guitar, and will also stick within the truss rod hole. Now we really do want to make sure that truss rod cover of all things is taken care of, because get too much finish on the end of the truss rod's not going to function correctly. Otherwise, then we'll do the tuning peg holes as well. And the reason for that is we don't want a lot of finish going down inside those holes, because you'll get a build-up of gunk, which will then make the tuners harder to install. Okay, now we've masked off our TE neck. The next thing we want to do is apply our clear gloss. So I'm using this Rust-Oleum clear gloss. It's a water-based gloss, so very fast drying. I'll aim to get about 3 coats on that today. Shake up the can and long passes across the headstock first. And then, because the headstock sits down recessed in that way, we can simply turn it over and spray the rest. Okay, just come up to my third and final coat for the day. Just want to point out a couple of things. So I'm only applying about 3 coats to this, and I'm going to gently sand back the heel. But if you're applying many thick coats, as you can see, that heel will have a lot of finish on it, and that can affect your action. So if you are planning on spraying many coats on the back of your neck, for instance, just make sure you fit the neck into the guitar itself, and just using a pencil or something similar, make a mark as to where the guitar extends out from the pocket, and mask off that area that's going to sit in the pocket. So I've got the TE kit back up on the bench. It's had 10 coats of clear gloss and about 5 days to dry. From here, what we want to do next is start flat sanding that clear gloss. So hopefully you can see, especially where the light's reflecting off the body, there's a peel effect, or an orange peel effect to the paint. And what that's really telling us is there's areas of unevenness in our paint, and that's why the light's reflecting differently. What we want to do next, taking about an 800 grit paper, something fairly fine, and a nice hard sanding block, we just want to start working that unevenness out of the paint. So I'm not sanding aggressively when I'm doing this, I'm just working the paint and removing that shine. As you can see, there's already quite a difference there. There's less shine to that area, but we also don't have that peel effect. And that's really what we're trying to do right across the guitar. So I'm going to sand this for the next few hours using my 800 grit. I'm going to be careful around the edges because the paint doesn't accumulate well there. And we'll check back in and see how progress is going then. So I've been sanding for a couple of hours now, and hopefully you can see on camera, we've removed almost all of that orange peel. There might be a few little specks here and there, but generally the next finer grit of paper will remove that. So I'm moving up now to a 1200 grit paper. I'm just repeating the same process, just basically just removing the scratch marks left from the previous grade of paper. This stage normally doesn't take as long as the initial sanding. There's obviously less work for the paper to do. So I've finished up with the 1200 grit now, and if I hold the guitar up to the light, hopefully you're seeing a reduction in those scratch marks. Admittedly, white's a little hard to see on camera, but that's another thing to keep in mind. If if this is your first guitar and you're choosing a color, white's actually a pretty forgiving color, unlike black, which will tend to highlight every scratch that you leave in the guitar. Okay, so from here I'm going to get onto a little bit of wet sanding. Now, I've left this 1500 grit soaking overnight, and you don't need to do that, but it's generally recommended. It softens up the grit, and the paper's just easier to work with. From here, again, I'm just going to use my sanding block. Now, it's important to use a fair bit of water when you're wet sanding. Now, you don't have to wet sand again, but if you do, generally I like to work with a higher grit paper when I do that. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind when you're wet sanding guitar bodies. Obviously, we've got holes on the body themselves, and water gets in those holes. There's end grain, unsealed timber in there that's going to swell up if it gets too moist. So definitely have a rag nearby, and just continually be removing any moisture that accumulates around those holes. I'm not sure if this is showing up on camera, but certainly from my perspective, I can still see some tiny scratches, but you really need to have the guitar on an angle and reflecting light to see that. So as I said, you don't need to wet sand. It's just a final step I do before using a fine grade steel wool. So I'll finish the wet sanding, and now I'm just going to follow up with some fine grade steel wool. So this super fine grade steel wool you can generally pick up at your local hardware store. And what this will essentially do is remove any scratch marks left from the previous high grade of paper. I've been polishing away over on this side for the last couple of minutes. I'm just going to hold the guitar up to the light. As I said, it's difficult to see in these lighter colors, but I think you can see a matte finish there. Bring the guitar down, bring the camera down, sorry. Hopefully you can see now there's no scratch marks left there, but we've got a much duller finish compared to, say, over here. And that's what the steel wool does. It gives you that matte finish. And if you wanted a matte finish on your guitar, you could pretty much stop after this stage. Now, when you do use steel wool, a lot of people don't like using steel wool, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Generally, when you're using steel wool, it leaves a lot of steel fibers on the guitar, so that can be a problem. So if you're using steel wool and a lot of fibers get caught up in your cavities, for example, and your next stage is polishing, you may turn the guitar over and those fibers end up in your workspace. And as you're applying a lot of force while you're polishing, you're pressing those fibers against the surface. And also because you're heating up the surface when you're polishing, those steel fibers are likely to embed into the guitar more. And the other thing to keep in mind also is with regards to hardware and electronics, especially the pickups, which are essentially magnets. We don't want any steel fibers left on the guitar that are going to be drawn to the pickups. So what I'd suggest, I still use steel wool myself. I think it's worth doing, but you do want to give the guitar a thorough clean off afterwards. As I said, we've got a nice matte, dull sort of finish. From here, we're going to bring that gloss back by applying some polish. So I've got two grades. I'm just using an automotive polish here. I'm firstly using a cutting compound, a heavy duty cutting compound, and I'll follow that up with a super fine cut. And I've got two clean rags here. And really, if you've ever polished a car before, it's the same situation. We're just rubbing in the polish, and we're working it pretty hard. Again, this is why it's a good idea to have definitely removed any metal fibers from the steel wool at this stage. And I'm just really working that almost as hard as I can into the paint. I've finished polishing up the TE body. As you can see, we've got that nice reflective surface back on the guitar, that nice glossy reflective surface. Now I've just used automotive polishes for that. So I had a heavier grade polish first, and then finish that up with a super fine grade. So now that our TE body is finished, next thing we want to do is complete the neck. As you know, we sprayed this in a clear gloss, and what we want to do now is flat sand that headstock. Now I've already done the majority of that using an 800 grit paper. I'm following that up now with a finer grit paper, a 1200. I've got that wrapped in an eraser just to have a little more control. Can be a good option when you're doing headstocks, as it allows you to get into those hard to reach areas a little more easily with still not having to use just your hands basically. And just make sure the scratch marks from the 800 are out. It can be a little bit tricky to work up to front of the fretboard like this, so the eraser is quite handy for that. It will conform to the curve but still give you a fairly decent base, as in it's not going to just ride over any bumps and lumps and things like that. And from here, I'll follow this up with 1500 grit and then steel wool and then polish as we do with the body. The back of the neck's a little different. So basically we want a fast playing neck. So what I would do is come through with my various grades of paper, as we have the 800 and now following up with the 1200. And once we're ready to steel wool, I would spend a lot of time on the back of the neck. So just using some fine grade steel wool, I'd really buff the back of the neck out. What you really want there is a nice thin finish. You want the timber sealed, but you also want the neck to play fast. And you'll generally be able to feel how the neck feels in your hands. So just keep buffing that up until you're at a point where you feel like the neck feels comfortable. So that marks the completion of the finishing stage of our TE guitar kit. So from here, we're going to be installing hardware, our electronics, and then doing a final setup of the guitar just to make sure it plays great.